Oh,
Morning, everybody. We're just waiting. We've just started the webinar. Just a brief pause just to allow people to log in through Zoom to make sure that we've got as many people with us from the beginning as possible, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think it looks like we're kind of leveling out now in terms of participants and attendees. So let's get started. So first of all, thank you very much for taking the time out today to attend the webinar. My name's Iain Murray. I'm the Director of Public Financial Management here at CIPFA, and I'm joined today by Professor Carol Adams, who's the author of our latest report on sustainability. So I just want to say a few words, and then I'm going to ask Carol some questions about the report. And there's also opportunity for you to ask some questions. And before I do that, just a few bits of housekeeping, if you don't mind. So your mics and cameras are disabled, so you won't be able to. Don't worry about coming off mute or suddenly appearing on the screen. That shouldn't happen. There is a Q&A box, and we'd like this to be as participative as possible. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box, and I'm sure some of those are a lot better than the ones I've got prepared for Carol. So we can use those to expand the discussion today, and also just so that people are aware that the session is being recorded, and we will be using the session. It will go on our YouTube channel at a point in time, and we will be using bits of it for social media. I think it's always better to know that you're going to be on a semi-permanent record rather than finding out after the event. So as I said, we're here to talk about our latest report on sustainability reporting, and at CIPFA we're really, we see this as a really important part of our work. I think it's easy to think of sustainability reporting as something new. It's certainly a kind of it's certainly expanding and exploding, but it really isn't actually, and it's been around for decades. And in fact, the work that we've done at CIPFA started back in 2013 when we launched our first publication, which was about how to produce a sustainability report. Much has changed since then, and as I said, this is a growing area of interest. I was talking to a colleague about this a few weeks ago, and we were reflecting that if we think about, as accountants and finance professionals, as we think about the amount of capital, human capital, the sort of systems, processes that goes into the collection and reporting of financial information. And if you were thinking about replicating that for non-financial information and for information in respect of sustainability metrics, well, we probably are at the sort of the foothills of a whole new discipline and a whole new profession, and that's very exciting. And it's if we want to think about this in I suppose in two broad ways. So we know that reporting is important, and I think it's true that you manage what you measure. So having transparency around how organisations are managing the risks associated with climate change, how they're positioning themselves in terms of demonstrating the total value of what they do to society is really important. So reporting is going to be a key part, but we're also really interested in how organisations start to factor these things into the way that they take and make decisions. And recently we've published some work looking at carbon pricing mechanisms and how those can be used to inform decisions. And I think you can probably, those of you who had a chance to look at the report will see that we also know that we sort of want to get started with this. We want to make sure that we know that sort of the finer points of what sustainability standards might say in terms of sort of reporting in various jurisdictions is still developing, but actually whatever they say, it's really important that we start to develop those systems processes. We start to develop the understanding, and we start to have the information that we need to make those decisions, so that when those things do arrive, we're well placed to meet those challenges. So I'm joined by Professor Carol Adams, and Carol is steeped in the history of sustainability reporting and impact reporting, and two, is the author of this report. So welcome, Carol. I don't know if you I suppose to start off with, I think it would be, as we said, the starting point for this was the work that we did in 2013, and it would be interesting to understand from you what you see as the things that have changed between now and then. And why it was important that we looked to refresh some of the material that was already out there.
Yeah, sure. So a lot has happened since 2013, and those 2013 CIPFA guidelines included some indicators around environmental and social issues, and also some indicators around cost, because value for money is an issue for many public sector organizations. But since then, we already had the GRI guidelines then. They have become standards. And in 2013, the Integrated Reporting Framework was published. We have the TCFD recommendations published in 2017, the SDGD recommendations in 2020, and of course IPSASB last year sort of declared an intention to develop some work in sustainability reporting and integrate that into some of its existing recommended practice guidelines as well. So a lot has changed, and I felt when I was doing this, it was no longer appropriate to list, sort of try and work out what indicators to put in it and so on, when we already have all these standards and guidelines that have been developed through a rigorous consultation process. And when I started to look at some of the guidelines that are out there in the public sector, some of the requirements in different jurisdictions for different types of public sector organizations, I felt there was a lot of effort being put in to sort of reinvent the wheel, really, when there are these existing standards that could be drawn on. And the public sector is very diverse. There's a whole range of different types of organizations and different sectors. So there is no one size fits all, as it were. And so this report sort of takes a principles-based approach, using principles and existing standards and guidelines, and then goes on to to suggest indicators, specific indicators where they already exist.
And I think that's the sort of the key message from the report, isn't it? Which is, so building on what I said earlier, which is we probably are, certainly in the UK, we're lagging slightly behind the corporate sector in terms of sort of sustainability reporting and that side of things. That's not unhelpful, actually. Sometimes it's useful to be the follower rather than the leader, and there's lots of learning I'm sure we could take from experiences that people have had in the corporate sector in terms of applying the standards. But I suppose what we're trying to say to people is that there's so much out there. I mean, what you just described is it's a real, a myriad of guidance. In fact, you could get somewhat lost in it if you weren't careful. But there are things out there that people can use as a starting point. And I suppose that absence of guidance is not a reason not to be starting the work that needs to be done I suppose to start to address some of these issues.
Exactly. And what I've tried to done is to guide people through what's already there.
I suppose just building on the sort of, I wonder whether we could, I suppose, for the benefit of those who aren't as steeped in it as you, and I'm kind of, I know I'm on a very steep learning curve with this on a personal basis, but it'd be interesting, you know, the difference, I suppose, between some of the, what we might call program reporting, so some of the things that sort of IFAC and maybe, you know, particularly IPSASB might be adapting for, and then the impact reporting side of things, which I suppose lends itself a bit more to sort of GRI, and whether it's helpful to sort of draw some of the distinctions there so that people can decide where a sensible starting point might be for them.
Sure. So in the early 2000s, GRI did some work on this, and they sort of identified that in the public sector there was the reporting on impacts of the organization, which is what the GRI standards covered. But then in the public sector, there's also a need to report on policy effectiveness and program outcomes very often. And, you know, where there's programs designed to help achieve better societal outcomes, better, you know, reducing impacts on the environment, or make a better contribution to the environment, then you'd want some kind of measures there. And that might be somewhere where the IPSASB recommended practice guidance could be adapted to help with that. So recommended practice guidance number 3, looking at reporting service performance information, perhaps could incorporate some sustainability indicators there. And to my mind, it would make sense for those indicators to be aligned with those used by the organization in reporting on the overall organization's impacts. And then you also have in the public sector what we call state of the environment reporting, that might include state of the economy, the well-being of society, and so on, which again is about it's about sort of taking an inventory of where we are on those areas that are covered by the report. But since that GRI work, we also now have voluntary national reporting to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals on a national level. And really to do this well and to really think about what you know, a whole country is doing about sustainable development does really require information from the public sector, from local government areas, government agencies, and so on. And again, the same sorts of measures can be used. I mean, GRI standards have sort of been linked with the SDGs. So similar measures might be there used as reporting for the organization as a whole. And if standardized measures are used for organizational reporting and so on, it would make these voluntary national reports, or taking any other sort of national inventory, much easier. And then a lot of public sector organizations also are starting to report, and I know universities in particular are starting to look at the value they create, not just for themselves, but for different stakeholder groups as well. So for students, for staff, you know, for society. And this again is very relevant because public sector organizations really exist to enhance value for a range of different stakeholders, and also to have a positive impact. So the impact reporting, you know, to my mind is central, and that can be about the organization, about programs, about policies, and so on.
I mean, the last point I think is the thing that's really struck me, which is, you know, the public sector is asked to demonstrate its value or its worth using kind of the financial or economic metrics, which are there, you know, from a corporate world, and they don't. And we know firsthand that sometimes they don't really tell the story, or they certainly don't tell the whole story of what the public sector does for society.
Exactly.
And that's where, you know, in some of the, if we get to integrated reporting, there's a fantastic opportunity for public sector bodies to be able to tell that story to citizens and residents about the totality of what they do and the value that they add to society.
Exactly. And where they're doing it, they're taking a broader lens than the integrated reporting framework is looking for, really, which is about, you know, looking for the value created for the organization. Public sector organizations like universities tend to look much broader than that, and look at the value that they're creating for communities and for different stakeholders.
And I suppose the other important role that the public sector has to play, as opposed to how this might play or, you know, manifest in a kind of a commercial setting or a corporate a commercial setting, is that the government obviously has a responsibility to try and change behaviours and you know, and influence those commercial entities. So there's that role, as sort of that regulatory role that government and the public sector play in this, as opposed to you know, corporate reporting, which is obviously focused on a maybe a smaller group of stakeholders in terms of their needs. So
and I do think reporting is really central to that transformation. So in the report, I've got a diagram using these themes, which are as sort of a slight variation on the TCFD themes, where looking at disclosures on the management approach, because to my mind, if you're getting organizations to think about the management approach by asking them to disclose it, that really does help them to change. So on the management approach disclosures, for example, under GRI standards, would involve engaging with your stakeholders and finding out what matters to them, finding out what are the material impacts that you have on them. And that is really important to the public sector. And then you've also got, you know, the strategy that's fundamental to change. So the report sort of sets out, from the various different standards and guidelines that are relevant, disclosures that could be used on strategy to get organizations thinking about it. And then, of course, governance oversight is another really important part of that change process. And there are quite a lot of disclosures on governance oversight in the GRI standard that are particularly relevant to sustainability reporting. And they're also there in the TCFD recommendations and the SDGD recommendations as well. So, you know, that those sort of processes on those disclosures on those sorts of processes, and the processes of setting targets as well and managing performance really do help that transformation.
We've just been called for acronyms, so maybe we could just unpack a few.
Yes, okay. So TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the SDGD is the Sustainable Development Goal Disclosure Recommendations, and they're linked and referenced in the report. I presume someone can put a link to the report on the chat.
We will do, yeah. That's absolutely. We've also got a question from the audience, so I'm going to ask that rather than planning ahead of mine. So thank you, Thomas, for this one. So Thomas is asking if there are any, if you know of any, or the most effective ways of representing, sort of accounting for the spillover effects of public sector organisations' work, particularly in the long term. So I suppose sometimes what public sector bodies are doing is taking a really longer term view of things, but you know, that's particularly challenging.
Yeah, so one of the disclosures required in standards and guidelines would be, you know, how do you go about setting targets in the short term, the medium term, and the longer term, and thinking about that and what those targets should be is certainly important.
So I'm sort of interested in, sort of based on the research and your experience, and I think it's worth saying, obviously this is a global thing, so this is so interested, I suppose, in what you see as the things that need to change in the public sector to enable sustainability reporting to become more widespread.
Well, I think and this applies not just to the public sector, but also the private sector. I think more resources do need to be put into it. Very often, if you look at an organization and look at the number of people involved in doing financial reporting compared to the number doing sustainability reporting of any type, there is a huge difference. And so the resources allocated to sustainability reporting do need to increase, and people need to start developing the skills to enhance their sustainability reporting practices. And some of that is looking at what is reported by other organizations, other similar organizations. That can be a starting point. But I do think also looking at the various standards and guidelines to get ideas is important. One of the things that we've talked about doing is going on to sort of collect some reports and then look at best practice reporting. But that, I feel, is perhaps a later stage, because I do feel there is a need to step it up before we can do that in a meaningful way, in a way that's going to be useful. Because I think every sort of public sector reporting organization is going to find scope for improving what they do.
No, and I think you're right, and I think it's it's quite a mixed picture, isn't it? And I think I'm aware that you do a lot of work internationally, and I suppose one of the things that I was keen to ask you is if people were looking for those examples of maybe those jurisdictions that are slightly ahead of others in terms of public sector reporting, without wanting to kind of hold you too much to it, where could people look at sort of some either emerging or existing good practice in terms of people who are already starting to do this? So
the public sector is so diverse. Where to start? I mean, there's the state-owned enterprises. Some of those are doing very well, and there's some good city reports I've seen from Australia and Germany and the UK, and also some good university reports. Not perhaps still needing to beef up the sustainability reporting side of that, though. Some of the university ones have been focusing more on just the value that's created without looking perhaps in so much detail at the sustainability reporting part.
So I think, Sarah, maybe hopefully I've asked you a question. I think so we'll move on to skills, because I think that's worth reflecting on as well. And I know that in some of the conversations certainly we've had, there's been there's some nervousness about whether this is a space that accountants or sort of finance professionals should be playing in, and whether we've got the right skill sets to do that. So I suppose interested in your perspective on that. And I suppose is this something which would sit, does it sit as part of a finance function, or is this a separate function? I suppose any thoughts you have about that side of things, which hopefully will answer one of the other questions we've been asked today.
Yeah, so it tends not to be located in the finance function, but I think there is much more that finance professionals can do. I really think sustainability reporting needs to be a collaborative effort. So information is collected from all over the organization. Human resources is quite substantially involved in as well. So finance professionals, they know about quality data, they know about data controls, they know what makes good audit evidence and so on. So they really do have a lot to offer, and it's well worth finance professionals talking to the people who are collecting the data and preparing the reports and looking at where they can use their skills to help in that process. And the conversations aren't happening as much as they could be.
I mean, I completely agree. I think if you look at the sorts of skills that particularly now we need to kind of get this started, it is about systems, processes and controls, and those are things which are, you know, should be bread and butter to accountants and finance professionals.
Yeah.
And you know, and I think so I don't think we should be, and as I said, I think there's a degree of, because this is whilst not new, this is sort of it is emerging now at pace. I think that we should be bold about the role that finance professionals can and should play in all of this. So so I completely,
absolutely.
agree.
I mean, another area of skill is knowing what information is needed to make decisions. But I think, you know, accountants perhaps need to think a bit more broadly than they maybe have done around, you know, the provision of environmental and social information for particular decision making, rather than just looking at the finance information.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose there was another question, sort of talking about where it might sit, the internal audit, and so I'm quite happy to. I think I don't think necessarily the function would sit with internal audit, but I think internal audit functions and the skill sets they have are really important in terms of that assurance piece. So actually, you know, testing whether those systems are delivering are producing information that is fit for purpose, that you can use to make decisions. And I think some of those skills, if you look at what a lot of sort of larger firms are doing at the moment, their sort of model is a blended assurance and subject matter expert, and those assurance skills are in high demand when it comes to ESG or sustainability, and how they start to shape what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So a question from Coral as well, and again, this is quite UK specific, so you may I'm happy to chip in if need be, but a really helpful suggestion actually, which is so at the moment in the UK, auditors look at there's a value for arrangements piece of work, which looks at economy, efficiency and effectiveness, but doesn't really look at equity. So it doesn't really look at that kind of, I suppose, that fairness point. And I suppose at the moment, again, if we look at what's happening in the corporate world and the assurance piece, it's quite a lot of what goes on there is it's very limited actually in sort of the level of assurance that's being provided on sustainability reporting. And there's an ongoing debate about whether it's one auditor or two. So do you have an auditor for your financial reporting and then a separate auditor or audit partner doing the sort of signing off the sustainability report side of things? I just wondered whether you had a view in terms of, I suppose, that assurance piece and how that might develop and evolve over time, so that people know that what's being put in sustainability reports is a fair reflection of reality, I suppose, rather than just an exercise in presenting the best possible version of events.
Yeah, look, I do think it's really important. You know, as I mentioned, that I sort of recommend a principles-based approach whereby you go about talking to your stakeholders to find out what are the key issues, and then you report on using indicators on those key material issues. Now, if that process isn't robust, then you're going to be missing material issues, and the report is of less value. So I really think assurance over those processes is very important. Yeah, a lot of assurance scopes look at just particular bits of data, but you know, I think to give the report credibility, you need it over those processes and the governance oversight as well, so that people trust that you're really reporting on all of the key issues and not sort of greenwashing over the entirety of the report. And the assurance can also bring up issues with processes and data and quality control, so you get information on how to improve what you're doing as well, and take it to the next level from that exercise.
Yeah, and I think assurance is really key, because I think particularly that the initial those sort of what are material, that's a judgment, isn't it, at the end? So that's and having an impartial view of whether management is exercising judgment just in the way that we do with financial information is really, really important. In fact, probably even more so here, because it would be easy for management to conveniently decide that something wasn't important because it wasn't.
And they do,
and
they do all the time.
Yeah.
And that, and it is tough just leaving it to judgment as well.
Yeah.
So if you leave something to management judgment and you don't have that robust process in place to back up the judgment, then you are in danger of not reporting something you should, and that comes back to affect reputation. So you may lose trust then with some stakeholders.
So really good question from Lisa about how we move this from a kind of a nice to do to a must do, and I suppose particularly how we get this factored into things like business cases and reports to audit committees and the such like.
Yeah, well, look, I really like to see it made mandatory in the public sector, because it is so important. We spend a lot of money on the public sector, a lot of taxpayers' money. So I think we should be looking to know and have some accountability for what those organisations are contributing to economy, society, and the environment. And I think I've kind of forgotten the rest of the question there. I don't think I've fully.
It's probably a question in two parts, isn't it? So I mean, and I think it will be mandatory. So I think so in the UK, it's definitely coming.
Yeah.
And we know that Treasury are starting to look at how that will play through in the public sector, and it we'll follow what's happening in the corporate world, and we'll start with those disclosures in terms of TCFD.
And look, this is another area where accountants can help in making the business case for more resources to be put into this kind of reporting. So that's something that accountants can certainly assist with too. Yeah.
And I think then the second part is about how it gets factored into decision making. So how you get, and I think that's an interesting one. So I know that, again, traditionally, sort of decision making in a public sector environment is made around it's made against a broad suite of indicators, but probably a lot of it, the economic one being the overriding thing. So any thoughts you have about how we start to live?
Yeah, well, I think that the starting point there is to look at what information is going to the board or the governing body. And making sure that they are getting sustainability information. They should really be signing off on sustainability reports and reviewing them, and then getting other information more regularly. So that is a way of getting it to the governing body, and then they incorporate it into decision making, into strategy. Going forward, the governing body sets a strategy, so that's a way of also getting that change going, that transformation. If they've got the data on your social and environmental impacts, your impacts on local community, they can start thinking about, well, what does that mean for our strategy going forward?
I mean, and I think, even if we just looked at in the UK and we just looked at the way that sort of public sector procurement has moved on, there's definitely been a greater emphasis on things like social value and those sorts of things through those exercises. And I suppose part of this is about organisations grasping the nettle really, and saying, actually, when we make these decisions, we want to make sure that we are taking a broad, as broad a range of factors in as we possibly can, because we think that that's important. And I do think, I do genuinely think as reporting has a role to play there, because the more expectation there is on an organisation to report against these outcomes or report against the impact that it's having, the more likely the organisation is to make decisions which will, which will better take that into account. So
absolutely, yes.
It's a bit chicken and egg, but I suppose you've got to start somewhere. And I suppose that was the other question, or one of the other questions I wanted to ask. So if we assumed that some of the people who've joined us today will probably be thinking about, will have a fairly blank sheet of paper in terms of where they are with sustainability reporting. And I know you've had some experience in sort of preparing sustainability reports yourself. What would you see as the sort of the most helpful starting points? So if you're keen to get started, where would you start, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah. Well, in here, obviously you have to report what's mandatory, but then, I would go to the tables in the report and look at, well, what are the various disclosures across the standards and guidance on governance oversight, on the management approach, and on strategy, and look at what you can disclose there. Look at where there are gaps in your processes from that. So you might, see by looking at the disclosures on governance that actually you're not doing quite enough there. And then you want to put that right, or your management approach might not be as rigorous around engaging with stakeholders as you think it might be. So then you can start to fill in those gaps so that you can report better in future, and also so that you do have better approaches and systems. And then determining, well, what are the really key things that your organization ought to be reporting based on what it does. And that's going to be very different if you, from, say, whether you're a health provider, a public sector health provider, or a school or a university or a fire service or whatever. What you report there is going to be very different. There's no one size fits all. So this process is really quite important. So determining what's relevant for you is important. And so that would be, there may be additional disclosures on top of those that are listed in the report that we're talking about today, that are there to guide. And organizations often find when they start doing this that they've got data that nobody sort of knew that they had and didn't do anything with. So and so has got some really important, interesting data, in a drawer, in a computer file more these days, that it doesn't go anywhere and isn't used, which is actually quite important and could go in such a report because it has wider interest. And so talking to people in the different functions of the organization also about, well, these are some indicators in standards and guidance. What do you think of them, and what more ought to be reported? And going through that process of engaging with external stakeholders too. Those would be the key starting points, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Again, in the UK, I think we have a really clear steer now that we will start with climate. That climate change will be the thing that we start with, and that will be how we kind of that will be the first thing that gets mandated, I think, through sort of government reporting manuals and those sorts of things. Yeah. And so I suppose for those of you
but I think in many countries there's already mandated disclosure requirements on, say, gender, race, disability, and so on. So whilst we're thinking of climate change disclosures being mandated, there are other areas of mandatory disclosures too already.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think the other thing is, so again, thinking about the sort of public sector entities I've worked with in my career, public sector bodies are already good at collecting non-financial information and reporting non-financial information. It's a really important part of what they do. And so some of this is about adding to the suite of what you already have, or adapting some of what you already have, rather than having to sort of feel that you're starting with a completely completely blank sheet of paper.
Yes, exactly. So the report sort of is designed to sort of give people ideas of where they can go next, you know, from wherever they're starting from. What else could they do to develop their reporting further? And thinking about your reporting strategy, you know, every year, once you've finished a report, think about, well, how am I going to develop it next time? Is also really, really important and good practice.
So another question from Andrew, which I think might be useful for us to touch on as well, actually. So why not simply use procurement contracts and terms and conditions to find data and enable both compliance and reporting? And I suppose there's a useful consideration there about supply chain and you know, some of this may not be information that bodies have themselves, but should be able to obtain, particularly where they're using third parties to deliver services.
Yeah, and that's I think particularly the case with Scope 3 emissions, isn't it? With say travel and so on. So some places might use one travel provider in order to keep a track of the emissions from flights and so on. Yes, that's good, and all of this, you know, putting pressure on suppliers also to provide you with that information, asking for that information, asking, say, when you buy a new carpet, you know, how much is the material recyclable, and what's it made of? Asking those sorts of questions and asking for that data puts pressure on your suppliers to do more as well.
And we see mechanisms like that appearing actually sort of through a sort of legislative route as well. So if we looked at something like extended producer responsibility, where you're not just you're trying to look at, you know, looking at that particular, the impact that has across the whole of the system or the whole of the chain, rather than just as sort of individual parts. And so it's placing responsibilities on organizations to think about the impact of what they're doing once the product you know, leaves their doors.
Exactly.
It's those sorts of things where,
and
I think those,
you know, that's a really good point you've made, because large public sector organizations have enormous power through their purchasing practices.
Okay, excellent. So there's still some time for some more questions if people, I think we've got some so I think this is so another question from this one's anonymous, but so it's a UK local authority, and obviously I suppose the political element and the imperatives often with elections and those sorts of things are a focus on tax and spending. So is there a lack of political engagement in sustainability reporting, and do we see that changing, and how do we impact? How can we I suppose make sure that change is positive? So public sector bodies are, I suppose, one way or another, they're political or politically led, and I suppose your views on where we are with that at the moment would be interesting as well.
Yeah, well, I think national governments around the world could probably do more on that. So many of them, you know, most of them would have signed up to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, have signed up to the Paris Agreement. And, you know, so what are they doing to make sure that the organizations that they're responsible for in the public sector are doing their bit in that regard? And I think certainly on the SDGs more broadly, there's a lot more that could be done in most countries to enable national governments who have committed to the SDGs to fulfill those commitments and responsibilities.
I mean, it's interesting. It's again a UK reflection, but if you looked at and I don't know the latest number because I haven't Googled it recently, but you know, I think over 300 councils in the UK have declared climate emergencies. So that would suggest that there is at least some acknowledgement that on some of these issues, you know, things need to move. And then if we were moving beyond climate and we think about that, so some of those other capitals where organisations should be already seeking to demonstrate that they're adding value, well, those should be things that that really chime with people who are in public service, whether they're a politician or an officer, I suppose.
Absolutely.
And as you say, everybody, the SDGs are there. They're sort of humanities setting out its stall for a better version of the world than the one we have at the moment, and vast majority of governments have signed up to that. So I know some organisations have done, and we've tried to do this at CIPFA with the latest iteration of our business plan, is actually looking at those sustainable development goals and thinking about which ones are most relevant to us and what we do, and almost building them in at to our objective setting, and how, what our ambitions and objectives are as an organisation. So I think there are things out there which you can use as reference points to help with some of that.
Absolutely, and the Sustainable Development Goal disclosure recommendations actually do, suggest an approach to select SDGs that you are most likely to have a positive or negative impact on, and then build that into your strategy. But going to your earlier point, climate change poses a huge risk to public infrastructure. And I think a lot of councils and cities, especially those in coastal areas, are probably have very detailed scenario analysis work done on the potential of sea level rises to wreak havoc and what that means.
Absolutely. So a request. So you mentioned earlier that you'd seen sort of some city reports and in the UK and elsewhere, and I just wondered whether you were willing to.
There's none coming to the top of my mind at the moment, I'm afraid. Okay. I can't think of any. I have seen some, but I just can't remember which ones they were just now. But I do think that's worth looking at. Going forward, looking at some of those best practice examples and doing some analysis on them to help reporters identify bits of best practice that they can pick up on.
I know that they're not necessarily.
I can't do that just now.
Not necessarily. I think, and I don't know if it's Highways England or the Highways Agency have done a lot. So they've been doing some sustainability reporting for a while, and it's actually the way it's presented. Is it's quite engaging, and so that's an example that people might want to look at in terms of so how it might be presented. One of the things we want to do off the back of this report is to start looking for some of those examples and sharing them, and also I suppose where people are starting to do this and they'd be willing to be sort of guinea pigs, we looking for sort of pilot sites and people to have a go at this and support them in whatever way we possibly can.
It'd be great, very helpful.
Well, got a few more questions. So Sarah's asking what can private sector learn from the public sector sustainability reporting and vice versa. So I suppose that knowledge share across the.
Yeah, look, I think the learning is more of the public sector from the private sector at the moment, because it's much more prevalent in the private sector, I think, than the public sector. So I do think there's a lot that can be learned there. But all those various standards and guidance that I talked about, there's a lot that can be picked up from there as well, in terms of looking at how to improve reporting. And a lot of it is relevant to both the public and the private sector. And the idea of just having a public sector reporting standard for sustainability, to my mind, doesn't work anyway, because the public sector is so diverse.
Yeah.
As I said, you've got SOEs, you've got local government, you've got all the different services that are owned by the state, and there isn't a one size fits all. What can the private sector learn from the public sector? Yes, I'm not really. I'm not thinking of anything at the moment.
I think there are some things that the public sector do. So if you again, if we looked at the sort of the TCFD disclosures, a lot of that is about risk management and governance and
that's true. Yes.
and actually I think the public sector does a lot of that. Certainly, we have through things like governance statements and those sorts of things. Actually, I think the public sector is well versed in doing some of that, and maybe in a slightly more open and transparent way than the private sector does. So I think although it's not necessarily sustainability reporting, I think there are some things that the public sector already do, which lend themselves to some of the things that they'll need to do here that don't exist in quite the same way in the private sector. I think my other impression, having spoken to people who are doing this in the private sector at the moment, is the main bit of learning is there's a lot of trial and error and a lot of hard work. I think to you can't guarantee the outcome. I think is the real challenge.
And I suppose one area of learning actually that the private sector could learn from is the reporting on policy effectiveness and programme outcomes. That is perhaps more steeped in the public sector than the private sector. But I mean, I was talking to somebody from the City of Melbourne Council well over a decade ago, and they had very detailed scenario analysis planning on the impact of sea level rises on the city then. So in those sorts of areas that, the public sector is advanced, we just don't often hear about it because it's not reported externally, and perhaps it's something that ought to be and could be, because it would be educational, and get more people on board with really considering sustainability implications.
So there's a couple of, I think rather than questions, they're comments from Andrew, and I'll just read them out because I'm not sure that everyone can see the Q&A. And then I think we've got one more question from and then we'll probably just kind of coming to time. So Andrew's helpfully pointed out that CDP can provide a framework for disclosures that public sector reporting can easily use, and which corporate uses, I suppose, particularly around kind of carbon and those sorts of things. But also that we do have a Green Finance Institute and we have climate bonds initiatives. So actually there are a number of, I suppose, mechanisms all out there in the market which are trying to take some of these things into consideration. He does point out though that the UK has not issued a single municipal green bond yet. So clearly some work to do there. And then I think the final one probably builds a little bit on what you were just saying, Carol. So do you see public and private sector approach is changing with sustainability? So the idea that sustainability is a business is an opportunity as well as a threat and a risk.
That's a really good point. Thank you for that one. And that's why I sort of changed the nomenclature from the TCFD talks about risks. I've changed it to management approach, more a different term, because I think it's really important to consider opportunities as well as risks. What are the opportunities in terms of services that could be offered, for example? I mean, there are some corporates that are offering products and services specifically to address sustainable development issues, and what can the public sector do there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we'll probably, I'll just check we haven't got any, seem to be bombarded with questions now. So let's do this last one, which is from Alex, and then I think we'll wrap up. And I think there was a question from Thomas about mailing or distribution lists. So yes, there's a sustainability section within the CIPFA website, and opportunity to sort of sign up there. I'm sure we can distribute the details to attendees outside of the webinar. So Alex is asking about comparability. So should international standards focus on comparability, or is it about, I suppose, providing relevant information to the entity? So is it about being able to,
so I think
compare entities, or about what's most relevant to the individual?
I think it's about both, and the comparability question is why I've suggested that we use existing standards, so we're not inventing slightly different indicators, and that then helps at a national level if all the public sector indicators are, they're calculated in the same way because you're using international standards. But then there will also be, on top of that, through that approach to determining material issues, there will be issues that transpire that are important to a particular entity, but also then there will be issues that are important to a particular country or area that organisations want to report or are required to report even.
Yeah, and I think that's, it's the same. The key thing is, and it's the same with financial information, isn't it? That as a user, you want to have some assurance that everybody is broadly playing by or applying the same rules when they're reporting information. And I think, some of them will be, I've heard arguments, particularly around some of the climate change stuff, that carbon is carbon, whether you're counting it in the public sector or the private sector, and water use is water use, regardless of where you
exactly.
And
recycling and equal opportunity. So, there's no need to have sort of special ways of calculating these things or a special list of indicators. You have the basic ones there already defined in these global standards and guidelines, and then you add to it what's particularly relevant to your organisation and your sector.
So it's probably the context and the dynamic that changes rather than necessarily the thing that you're measuring.
Right.
I think we're just about at time there. So first of all, thank you all for your time today and for the questions. Thank you very much, Carol, for being grilled this morning on sustainability reporting, and I hope people have found that useful. As I mentioned earlier, so there is a sustainability section of our website at CIPFA. We can circulate details outside of the event, and I hope you will have an opportunity to read the report, and I hope it helps as we start to step it up on sustainability reporting. So thank you all for your time today.
Cheers. Thank you all.